Welcome everyone. We are in the virtual salon, literary living room of Globus Books store in San Francisco, and I am extremely excited. I can't even think of a word for it, how excited I am to greet one of my favorite modern writers, Alla Gorbunova, with her book Конец света, любовь моя, It's the End of the World, My Love, which is now, as we speak, is being translated into English by a wonderful translator, Elina Alter, who is joining us today as well. Alla is joining us from Karelia, part of the world that not many of you might have heard, unless you are from Russia. It's close to Saint Petersburg, and Alla is from Saint Petersburg, living in Moscow, and we are very grateful for her to join us today. And we also thank Catherine Yan, a fellow writer and poet and translator, who made it all happen. Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for being here. I will formally introduce Alla and Elina, and we will start with the interview where mostly Alla will answer questions, and we have some questions for Elina. Elina will read some from her translation, and then we will have a question and answer session with our audience both in Zoom and on YouTube. And thank you very much, Alla, for choosing to speak English with us today. We are grateful because many people in Russia already know this book. It won a lot of awards. There are tons of reviews being written. It's being discussed. There are debates about it. And fairly so. It should be discussed. It should be reviewed. It should be closely read and understood, but it doesn't exist in English yet. So our show is a preview to get Globus audience and just wide literary circles excited about this masterpiece, truly. And I rarely say that. So let me introduce Alla. Alla is a poet, prose writer, translator, and critic. She has published 5 books of poetry and received the Andrei Bely Prize for her collection Пока, догорает, азбука, while the alphabet is still burning, my loose translation. Her first collection of short prose, Вещи и уши, I will not translate that. I will let Elina or Alla say that in English, was published in 2017 by the Saint Petersburg publishing house Limbus Press. Her poems have been translated into English, German, French, Italian, Spanish, Serbian, Danish, Swedish, Finnish, Latvian, Bulgarian, Slovenian, Greek, and Chinese. I wanted to read it all just to feel how many translators felt that these poems should be enjoyed in their languages. And her prose has been translated into English, Italian, Bulgarian, Polish, Serbian, Slovak, and Romanian, and it's possible that I'm missing some languages. But this is very impressive, and it's very well deserved. So today, Alla will present her new book, It's the End of the World, My Love, with this remarkable cover, and we will mention that during the interview. And Alla is joined, and we will be also led by Elina Alter, who is a writer and translator living in New York. Her translations of Alla Gorbunova are forthcoming from Deep Vellum, and we might be joined by the publishers as well. Elina is an oral history fellow at the Yiddish Book Center and the editor of Circumference, a journal of translation and international culture. My name is Zarina Zabrisky. I'm a San Francisco author. I write in English. I have 5 books, and I've been published in many countries. And I am the host and curator of this channel. And this is my capacity right now. Globus Books, importantly, is a tiny, independent, what they call in America, small bookstore. Nevertheless, very powerful. It's been serving San Francisco for 50 years, since 1971, and survived many calamities, including COVID. It offers a wide range stock of books on all things Russia and the former Soviet Union and even Russian Empire. Globus is actively working with the libraries across the states or completing their holdings for Russian publications, contemporary and out of print. Our team is well known for its expertise in first editions of Russian literature, books on the Russian avant-garde, early imprints, travel and voyage books, and recently, the last couple of years, under the new management, Globus strives to serve the Bay Area, bridging gaps and continuing cultural traditions, and importantly, giving the voice to misrepresented communities, both in Russia, the US, and also worldwide. And we've been having the shows with writers, art historians, journalists from all around the world. So check out our YouTube channel, subscribe to it, because that helps us to continue with this work. And here I will abandon all the introductions and just first greet everyone. A quick round of hello. Alla, thank you so much for joining us, and please say hello to our audience.
Hello. Great thanks to Globus Books for inviting me and for organizing this event. I'm very glad to be here today.
Thank you so much, Alla. And Elina, would you like to also say hello to everyone?
Yeah, thank you for organizing this, and thanks to Alla for being here, and to everyone else who's watching now or in the future, I guess, on YouTube.
Thank you, Alla and Elina. So I have prepared some questions for Alla. It wasn't easy because I had gazillion of them and my head was exploding and I had to choose and restrain myself. So let's go straight to the questions. I read a lot of your interviews and listened to them too, Alla, and it was really thought-provoking. And in one of the interviews, you said that It's the End of the World, My Love, here it is again, is a book about the spiritual journey. And we will consult with Elina about the translation. In Russian, it's Духовный путь. The extreme life-changing experience, the truth concealed in the world of mundane, the encounter with darkness, livid with the end of the world on one's mind, and the path to the motherland, or maybe we can call it a birthplace, Rodina. And basically, to me, you listed in this interview the steps of an initiation ritual as described in Fraser or Prop, or anthropologists or folk scholars' works. You said that you want your book to become a certain reality, the world of its own, so that the reader would face this reality. In Russian, поворачивается лицом к этой реальности. And it is a moment of recognition for me, because in Russian fairy tales, of course, at the beginning of the journey, the hut on the chicken legs turns to face the hero, the main character, to let her or him into the other realm. And according, again, to those very folklore studies, the hut is a portal on the border between the material world and the world of the ancestors, the world of the dead. The hut on the chicken's legs does appear in your book, only it seems to me, after reading and rereading many times, that you have reversed this relationship. And it's the hero that is turned into the hut, and that other reality pulls the reader inside, and we, or at least I, was sucked into this world that you have created. Did you intend your book as the rite of passage for your readers? And do you think that books and literature can offer such a shamanic experience in general?
Dear Zarina, thank you for a question. I think it is the bar mator on the border of human world and the forest that represents the hut and chicken legs in my book. And maybe somewhere there is the hut and chicken legs in буквально. I don't remember if it is mentioned as a hat and chicken legs, but the same function, I think, has bar mator. And yes, I agree with you, and I believe that some books provide the reader with a possibility to live through shamanic experience, or I would rather say extended experience of reality. I assume that a book shall generate a certain work. That is, the mission of a book is not just to tell the readers about something, but to show something and engender some changes. In this context, such a book can really serve as a kind of a ride or trip. What is definitely should not represent being an object to be read for pleasure, since it simply would not work in this case. Undoubtedly, it has a technical aspect for me, and I think that it should be used for its intended purpose. That is, one should let it do something to one's inner self and follow it where it leads. Otherwise, it will just remain words on paper. And I don't really like the word literature, because usually in literature, the reader observes things as if from the outside, from the position of external observer. The reader is thus placed in a safe and partly consumer's position. On the contrary, I wish to remove this distance. I want my book to be not an item of literature, but a form of life, which turns the reader towards the real. I don't want to create something to be designated as object or literature. I want something to really happen in this book, in the book.
Well, thank you for that. I think you've really managed it. It happened for me. I was haunted by it, and I lived in that world. And it happens sometimes, but it happens rarely. And I still have a certain sentiment of the word literature. For me, it does represent this high art and high experience. And I agree that literature shouldn't be read for pleasure. It's the hard work. We have in our audience Nina Kosman, a writer and a translator who's been on our shows before, and we had this discussion that the word soul, dusha, can be interpreted in many ways, and interpreted usually differently in two cultures, in the English language culture and in Russian language culture, and it's a separate subject. But here I think you give us the trip, the journey of the soul in a Russian sense of world. And we're not going to go down there to discuss the word dusha, but this is certainly something to be discussed eventually. Thank you so much for the answer. And my other question is about the composition of your book. And I also wanted to introduce the future readers of the English version or the Russian original to the book without giving it away. So here's my question about the composition. In the composition of your book, it reminded me of Bosch, Hieronymus Bosch triptychs, a mix between two of them, The Garden of Earthly Delight and The Last Judgment. In your book, you have 4 parts. The triptychs, of course, known for 3 parts, but they in reality have 4 parts because they're 3 interior panels that tell the story of heaven, the Garden of Earthly Delight, or the Last Judgment, and hell. And then the exterior panels that close the interior, and they depict either the creation or patron saint. And the world you have created in your book is inhabited with these fantastical creatures that are similar in many ways to me, to Bosch's phantasmagorical beings. You flesh out this world so well. It has its own map and chronicles, and its own epic and myth and folklore. And the map of the three worlds that your narrator draws as a teen is right there in the beginning of the book. It's the material, astral world, the one between the material and divine, and the spiritual or inner world. And then there is an addition, like the external panel or extension of the divine world, the wonderland at the very end. So that's the composition of the triptychs. And the cover, again, is like really hypnotic. It was designed by Dmitry Chernagayev, and it has this anthropomorphic houses with the hands sticking out of them and the eye watching. I was wondering if you had Bosch in mind by any chance, and if there is any connection.
You know, I have never thought about that and never consciously built this connection. However, a bond may exist even if we are not aware of it. True? I believe the most interesting ties arise like this by themselves. The meanings and images existing in the world may form all sorts of patterns and create amazing intersections. Thank you for this quite interesting observation involving Bosc. By the way, I can say that some critics have also compared my poetry with Bosc's paintings.
I wonder then if you can say a couple of words about the composition, not in relation to Bosch, but composition by Alla Gorbunova.
It's some organic structure. The stories from the book were written in different time, and the book was writing itself, so it made its structure during several years, and I just felt that it must be this way. So it's like some musical themes, some maybe some polyphonic music, symphony. When you look on the same stories, the same persons, same events from different aspects, like the story which happened with the subject of the story, with the protagonist, like story in reality, and so it may be called like different levels of psyche, different psychic levels, and different angles and different levels of some deep insight, maybe. And so it goes like music, and it at the end it has it makes a circle, some round structure. The final and the beginning goes together.
Right, I could see that, the connection. Of course, polyphonic, and I mean, it does, if you think about it in terms of music, it's like Schnittke's music in a way. I mean, there's so many voices and so much happening on so many levels. And of course, for our readers, future readers, you'll have to read it in order to appreciate the complexity of this composition. My next question is about the first part of the book, and I will have question about each part of the book. So again, not to give it away, but to give some idea to people who are watching us now. So the first part of your book is called Against the Law, and it is autobiographical fiction stories of coming of age, of becoming, of learning the world and self, metaphysical rebellion, and begetting an extreme spiritual experience, as you said it yourself in one of your interviews. It is the material world, paradise lost, the earthly garden of delight, again with Bosch reference, or Mikhail Bakhtin's Carnival, the festival on flesh, and you do refer to Bakhtin in one of your stories from the first part. The protagonist is crossing the line, and here I always want to give the Russian translation because преступление, the crime in Russian, has this connotation. You literally, преступление means crossing the line. and your heroine and your narrator is doing it non-stop all the time. Considering you are mentioning and quoting both Rimbaud and Blake, is it fair to suggest that your protagonist is deliberately destroying the senses and opening the doors of perception in order to get rid of the constraints of the reason, the reign of consciousness, in order to reach the proverbial ancient truth, to find oneself in the spiritual desert, to face and find Satan or her own demons or her own shadow, her own dark self?
Yes, that's true. There is a gnostic implication in the title Against the Law. On your relationship with the shadow, if we appeal to Jung, I would not call this only a struggle. This is rather acceptance and recognition of the dark side in oneself, acquisition of integrity. However, I think that the whole of this alchemical story should not be interpreted in isolation from the existential aspect. One of the critics called this book an existential thriller. A man learns about the world from the swaddling age in a situation of no reference points. The book can be treated in terms of mysticism, psychoanalytical theory, philosophy. However, all the things pass in my perception through the existential dimension, through the direct experience of being.
Right, that's an excellent answer, and that pretty much how I felt it worked. And again, so many levels. For the readers, you'll just have to read it. So the second part of the book, and it's quite a transition. You literally do not expect it. You are so settled within this first narrative part that it's almost jarring, but in a good way, in a cathartic kind of way. In the second part, which is called The Bar Called Motor, this transition goes like this. It consists of fairy tale-like stories that take place in a certain location, and it's both real, this place exists in Karelia, where Alla is now, and it is mythological. There's this bar called Motor, in the vicinity of Saint Petersburg, on the border of the material world and the magical forest. And it is a liminal space. The characters struck me as archetypal, primal, such as the Russian beauty, which could be interpreted as Jungian anima with her double nature, or Baba Yaga. She is a medium between the two realms. She takes you from one to another. There's also Kashey the Deathless, the dark birthplace, very powerful image, the motherland. The invisible paths with the tracks of the unknown beast, to quote Pushkin, lead us as the readers into the realm of the dead. And you said in another interview that first and foremost, the book deals with the world as is, just as you said it now in your answer as well. And it feels though that we are in the mirror reflection of the world. You create a clone or a shadow of the main character, almost a sci-fi move, and you lead the readers into the labyrinths of the mirrors in which they recognize themselves next to the unknown. And it reminded me very much of Tarkovsky's Solaris. Can you comment on the second part, your intent behind it, your inspiration, or your own reading of this part?
Thank you very much for your question, Zarina. The point for me is that the world as it is not equal for me to mundanity, everyday routine, the reality which is usually depicted by realistic art. What the world in fact is a very big question. Of course, I don't believe that the world is the place where people go out to work and watch TV at home, while anything that contains fantasy, mysticism, and all sorts of invisible things represent not the world but its reflection. I query this very distinction, the same as the distinction between sleep and reality. In my view, there is no such opposition. The reality of everyday life, the reality of a dream, a world of shadows, labyrinth of mirrors. They merge one into another. The oniric may be a focus through which the real is seen. The real can appear more tangibly in the reality of a dream than in the reality of the mundane, while the mundane reality may appear to a great extent to be a dream, a picture. The reality of everyday life is in no way equal to the real, from the big letter, from the big book, the real. When I speak about the real, I rather refer to something approximating to what Jacques Lacan meant by this word. There can be different configurations, different layout of space, exposure of different layers of psyche and reality, woven through a maze of shadows or reflections. But for me, this is not an attempt to describe the world or worlds, but rather creation of a life form, a configuration into which the real as such shall enter. No matter how vast or total the world which exists in poetry or prose might be, it must contain some empty space, a blind spot. There is a prerequisite of openness, which represents the premise for existence of the world, and that prevents its turning into a closed structure.
Right. Well, thank you for that. And I'm looking forward to listening to it again, which I will soon before putting the show on the air again. That's a lot to think about. And it's easier, I think, for me to hear it now because I read the book several times. And for, again, our audience, you are in for a thought-provoking experience, as you could see. Let's keep going and talk about the other parts of your book. The third part, Ivan the Boar Knee, we have already crossed that border, or you know, maybe we're already in this one space, as you just said, but for me, as I first read it, the Russian beauty from the second part was a shamanic figure, both dead and alive, and she to me, she's the god of the realm of the dead, and already ushered us into the dense forest of this Jungian collective unconsciousness, unconscious, or to me it was both hell, and also my associations was the heart of darkness, the horror, or the ancient horror of Leon Bakst. And you did say, you mentioned Lacan before in your interviews, that it feels like the real is revealed only through some kind of horror, which to me, it makes sense in this third part. We are undergoing this initiation ritual and we are temporarily dead and need to face and survive our fears to come back to the world of living with the vision, as per Fraser or any anthropological research, right? So part 3 for us as readers, or for me, let's say, becomes a trial. I was hit by this remix of fables in the spirit of Artaud's theater of cruelty. They are very Hoffman-esque fairy tales, and you do mention Hoffman as one of your favorite authors. They're prose poems and parables that also reminded me of Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra and Blake's The Marriage of Heaven and Hell. And here comes Dostoevsky and Jim Morrison. But anyway, whatever your associations are, they're very subjective. Our sensibilities as a reader are crushed We don't expect it. We are shocked out of our conventional beliefs, liberated from the rational. And the revelations and the visions then are delivered. And that in turn is apocalyptical literature, where the revelation uncovers what was previously unknown, in particular the details of the end of the world through the vision. And you did say that the real for me is a breakthrough of sorts and the unspeakable beyond words. And for me, this is the definition of poetry, the unspeakable as being torn, the tear in the unspeakable, beyond words. These are pure energies, like in Blake, as opposed to the cold power of his horizon, if you know Blake's mythology. And writing such breakthrough stories is really harsh on the author. How do you create them? Do you have visions like Blake? Do you see them in pictures? Do you hear voices? And another question is, how do you recover from them, from these visions?
I have visions and I have practiced lucid dreaming for years. However, originally I see, but mostly not with my eyes, what I write, what subsequently becomes poetry or prose. I would describe this experience as follows. Suddenly, there appears some intensity, the whole compressed into a dot, a pure creative potential, a call addressed to me, which again is not heard with the ears. I might say that I see this intensity, this target. These intensities are unfolding in a continuous flow during the process of writing. I do not regain the original state of mind after living through them. I am constantly mutating. They do something to me and I turn into something else.
One can feel it while reading it. That I think I could feel it. There I was tempted, and then I decided to go for it. To do, I don't like the expression close reading, but that's what it is. It's rather an example of such a breakthrough moment and the impossibility of speaking about it. So here is my reading of one of the most brutal stories in this part, Trishka's home porn studio. I read through the epigraphs and the telling names, the quotes hidden in the text, direct, indirect, and they provide the keys to hidden meanings or to the code of a sort. So one epigraph is from Turgenev's Bezhin Lug. In that story, peasant boys tell the legend about a deceptive and invincible evil being named Trishka, which is the name, the main character in your story, who appears just before the end of the world and seduces people into sin. There's also a character named Vavila, a foolish peasant mistaken for Trishka, and the second main character in your story is also called Vavila. Trishka and Vavila are the protagonists, right? So, and Turgenev notes that the belief in Trishka reflects the legend of Antichrist. Because the book is called It's the End of the World, My Love, you immediately start thinking towards that. As if it's not enough, you give all these other hints. Trishka's patronymic is Iaganovich, the son of Iogan, John, and it might be, or probably is the reference to Dr. John Faust, associated with Satan, his legend is, and Johann Goethe. And Trishka's last name is, interestingly, Strutsky, which is an archaic word which used to mean a worthless person, a trifle, a nonsense, according to Dostoevsky, and also an official, an important government worker, according to Apollon Grigoriev's reading. Now, furthermore, Trishka is bald with small eyes and a rash of leprosy on his forehead, and so is the son of Satan in the Hebrew Apocrypha, The Secrets of Simon ben Yochai, according to Boris Derevensky's book about Antichrist. There are other quotes from that book in your story. There are also many other clues pointing to the nature of Trishka, his satanic nature, such as quotes from the third book of Ezra. The sun and the moon will shine in the middle of the night 3 times a day, and blood will drip from the tree. That's the quote from the story. There's little Lila, Trishka's victim, who draws the beast like a leopard, his legs like those of a bear, and his mouth is like the mouth of a lion, which is the Antichrist from John's Apocalypse. And Trishka tells another character, Verechka, which is diminutive for Vera, face. I will elevate my throne above the stars of God, and I will sit on the mountain and the host of the gods at the edge of the north. I will ascend to cloudy heights. And that's his quoting Satan from the book of Isaiah. There are many other quotes, but I will stop here. It's clear that you are sending the reader to these sources. Then there's the second epigraph that refers to the icon of the Mother of God. And this icon, as I did a little search and I found out, known as softening of evil hearts. The Virgin is depicted on a cloud with 7 swords stuck in her heart, 3 on the right and left and 1 below, and she is holding the dead baby Christ. Above the bed, on which Vavila tortures and kills 7 women, graphically, hard to read, is the photo of a lady with 7 swords stuck in her heart. The lady in black at the end of the story carries a dead baby. So this story hits you very hard on so many levels. It's extremely visceral. And one of the possible meanings that I found was that Antichrist appears at the end of time, posing as Christ. The God is dead, and in your book, it is a post-Soviet Antichrist, a petty official, the neighbor upstairs, who is streaming psychotropic porn into citizens' souls and makes a bargain with the people's deputies, members of the party called Just Russia, Справедливая Россия, as in Justice for Russia. And Trishka's clients are politicians, businessmen, representatives of show business and other aspects. The murdered women, like the Mother of God, are pierced with the weapon through their souls and appear in the clouds, bidding farewell to the Antichrist and greeting the resurrected Savior. And I had so many questions. And does number 7 stand for the sorrows experienced by the Mother of God, as in some Christian traditions, or are the 7 swords associated with the 7 deadly sins? Or do the victims stand for the 7 stars of Apocalypse? And also the names of the victims are so telling, but I couldn't decode all of them. Ninel Vladlenovna is the take on Lenin. Vera and Lyubov are Faith and Love. And then there's Nizhdana, Lila, and Gayana, and Katya Amanda. And I wanted to read it too, and I didn't get it. And I know that it's just one level, because there was another level that I didn't need to decode. But is there a way to speak about the symbolism here without killing the story with such decoding? Because I wanted to do both, or maybe more than that, maybe 5 different things I wanted to do with that. So is there a way to keep the breakthrough and the unspeakable and combine it with the rational knowledge, Alla?
Zarina, thank you for the considerate reading of my story. Yes, this story contains a lot of symbolism, and you were everywhere true when you decoded this symbolism, I think. Honestly, I don't think that decoding of the symbolism might be the sole key to this story, because there is a web. The web is involved here, and the symbolism is just one of the components. And even if one analyzes the other conceptual dimensions of the story, something will escape the analysis, some elusive tailing, and it's good that it will remain. I always find it very interesting when someone analyzes my books, and I can observe how good critics have the ability to sense the inexpressible and at the same time to analyze the text rationally. So I know that it is possible. I saw such reviews, such essays about my book. Um, Generally speaking, I think that uh, coupling and combining the inexpressible and the language itself is quite a big problem, and I constantly bump into it when I write my texts. The intensities which I see, they are very difficult to translate into speech because they do not have any content area. They are principally structured in a different way. And I do not really understand how to convey them through language, avoiding such resultant phases like eternity smells like oil. You know, it's a famous phrase. But at the same time, language itself enters into quite complicated reference relations with what it is talking about. Language in poetry, for instance, is able to turn inside out, walk on the edge, and do something nearly impossible. Uh, and I think that it is hardly possible to combine the inexpressible with the language, uh, with the type of language which is just telling things, and with the reasoning that just reflects. And if we really want to capture the breakthrough and the unspeakable, this should involve some transformation of language and intellection. But this transformation, it doesn't make it irrational. It can be, because rational thinking, it's not schematic, not very easy logical thinking, but our rational thinking has very many levels, and it can be very we can think with paradoxes, and so if we think that rational is a very huge word, and there are a lot of things which are difficult things, but I can say that they are rational, but in a, not in sense of rational.
Again, in everything that you write or say, there are so many levels. So even the rational gets several dimensions, and I agree. And again, that could be the whole different discussion. I mean, I wish we could have, you know, a series of interviews with you, because I want to hear more. But getting back to the book, and speaking of language, I want to note here that I was particularly struck by the language in this book. I think it's outstanding because it's deceptively simple, and it is beautifully simple. I find sometimes that in modern literature, both Russian and English language written books, there's something that bothers me, as they're too much. There's overload of words. And I found that in this book, there's not a word to spare. Like each word has a meaning. And that's partially why it's so powerful. And getting back to the composition, and here would be my last question for now about the book, and that's about the fourth part of the book. Remember, for my association of the external panels of the triptych, it's called The Return to Paradise, and the reader and the narrator arrive back to heaven, or literally the title of the chapter, or to its memory. The rite of passage for the reader and for the narrator is over. We get our God back in an unusual form. It is literally the box of buttons. So I read it as things as they are, as you say in Allah, the world as is, this reality and non-reality that merge together in a God-like divine form, so blatant. And of course, my favorite English language poet is William Blake. So for me, it was another breakthrough. And it is both the memory of creation and patrons, like in Bosque, you know, the parents are the patrons. Here we have the return to Eden, and it is the return to self, the essence of the soul, or as you call it, the wonderland, and the cradle of God. The grown-up material life here, I thought, and now I have to rethink it after listening to your answers, but it seemed to me that it's someone else's dream into this anaric world. We again see the world, and you quote Blake here, in a blade of grass. You mentioned the blade of grass, and to quote Blake directly, and heaven in a wild flower, and we hold infinity in the palm of our hands in that chapter, and hence eternity in an hour. So enough of my reading. What is your reading of your epilogue, Alla?
Zarina, you have described it so beautifully, and I even don't know what to add. I can just add that when I was writing this text, I wanted it, among other things, to remain for my son as a door to my heart that would always be open to him.
And that is also beautiful. And I think at the end of the day, the bottom line of all these questions is that you will have to read the book once it's translated in English, or if you read Russian, in Russian. And speaking of translation, of course, importantly, we have Elina Alter here, and we're very grateful for this opportunity to get a glimpse through the window of the work in progress with Elina. And I have a couple of questions for Elina too, because even as I was writing my questions, I bumped into issues with translating things. So I really admire the work of translators here. And I was curious, Elina, a couple of questions for you. There are so many references to the 90s and 2000s life in Russia in this in Alla's book, and then the USSR already disintegrated, but just like in the USSR, certain things were particular to that place and time. How do you translate them? Do you use footnotes to explain them? Or do you try to accommodate the explanation inside the text? In Globus, we carry this great edition of Master and Margarita in Russian, actually, with footnotes and illustrations. It's like a little encyclopedia of life in the 30s, plus all the historical references. And to me, it looks like a great idea for translations, but of course, it might not be fit for all the books. So how do you handle this, Elina?
Yeah, the Master Margarita edition I think is a great edition, and it's also nice to have it alongside other editions that maybe don't have the armature, the footnotes, the endnotes. I love endnotes personally in general because it's a very fun thing to do, and as a translator you get deeply into them. But I think for this book, what I'm trying to do right now, since it's a work in progress, and obviously that's something that the editors and I are going to talk about, and Alla will also talk about with us as the translation kind of proceeds, is in as much as possible to do the explaining in the text for things that don't, for things like in the story that I think I'll read in a little bit, just when there's a reference to like a wine or a beer or something, that's easy enough to just slip in the word, right? Like wine or beer, and it doesn't require a whole explanation necessarily, though an explanation might be fun, but it does thicken I think the reader's understanding of the 90s, of the world of the 90s, just enough that it becomes something that, you know, comes to life, if that makes sense. Yeah, so to answer your question more succinctly, for the time being, I think that I'm trying to accommodate as much explanation as possible in the text without overweighing the text, because as you were saying, there's not a word to spare really, so I don't want to make it balloon for some reason.
Right. And I admire your work, and I'm looking forward to reading it in English too, because I do love reading books. I love in all languages I can read, which is not many, but still. And I also have another question on that note. And I already mentioned that in the beginning of our interview, that some expressions in Russian are imbued with many additional meanings, and they are just different in English. How do you translate phrases and words like dusha, the spirit or soul, or spiritual journey, духовный путь? What is it? I was lost. Then there's обыденность. I translated as mundane. It was deeply unsatisfied with this translation. And then, of course, there's Rodina, which one word carries so much in it. And is it motherland? Is it fatherland? To me, it was more like birthplace, but maybe it loses some connotations. And what are the other words and concepts that presented problems for you while working on translation? And how do you usually find the right way to solve these problems?
Yeah, that's a great question that has no answer at all. So whatever this is going to be very unsatisfying. But I think in terms of words like that seem to have either like a very specific cultural meaning or like a very rich meaning that is inevitably going to be flattened with whatever the English is going to be. I think something that I think about that I try to establish is whether a word should be translated the same way every time, whether it's important that we keep returning to this one word, or whether it actually, the fact that it recurs in the text allows for new meaning, allows for a kind of like accretion of meaning because I can use a different English word every time for it. So it's a case-by-case situation. Like even in the first story where there's everything in the first paragraph is like хороший дед, хороший занавески, whatever. That seems to be kind of a nice, funny repetition, whereas elsewhere that, you know, an English word has to fit. But elsewhere there might be, you know, opportunities for a lot of different variations on the soul, I guess, if that makes sense.
It does, and also it makes even more sense how important your work is and how difficult. So kudos to you. And now the main goal for me for this show was to give the taste of this incredible book to the future readers of it in English, and for those who didn't have a chance yet to read it in Russian. So our next step on this journey in our initiation into Alla Gorbunova's world is reading the stories that Elina has already translated. And you chose the story from the first part, right, Elina?
Yeah, just I think it's the opening story in the book.
Yeah, well, let's read it. Let's hear it. Thank you so much, Elina.
Great. Yeah, thank you. And something just as a last word about translation, it's also nice to be able to ask Alla these things because I think that she has a lot of thoughts about it also, and it's nice to be able to talk about the English as well as the Russian. Okay, so I'll read the first story from It's the End of the World, My Love, which is also called The End of the World, My Love. And it's a work in progress, so thoughts on this are definitely welcome. And I'm very grateful to Alla and also to everyone at Deep Vellum for also recognizing that this book should be translated and read by as many people as possible. Okay, so It's the End of the World, My Love. When I was a child, what scared me the most was the end of the world. I was afraid of change in general. It seemed intuitive that change would largely be for the worse. Changes for the better were not likely. I was surrounded by nice things, and it felt nice being in their midst. In the morning, sunlight came in through the bedroom windows, which faced east, and illuminated the orange drapes. It was a nice sun, and there were nice drapes. My very nice grandpa pointed out the nice stars in the evening sky, and in the spring he showed me the budding leaves, which were also, as you might guess, pretty nice. Summers at the dacha, I would wake up in a state of ease, full of happy anticipation, and my friend Nadia would come over with an inevitable pack of cards in her pocket. It was clear even then that it would be far better never to grow up. One day my father said, "Someday you'll understand that happiness is anticipation." One of the adults our family knew said that children can have a kind of complex that consists in a fear of change and the desire for everything to stay as it is. I definitely had this complex, and the most frightening change of all was the end of the world. Also, there were some terrible facts of a cosmic nature to consider. My grandpa had told me about entropy, and I understood that chaos grows exponentially and that the universe is moving toward its death. Then at school, we watched a film about the impending death of the sun. There were simulated shots of how the sun would become huge and red, and then parts of it would start falling onto Earth, and Earth would catch on fire, and then the sun would totally die. After the film was over, just to be sure, I went up to my teacher and asked, Lyubov Mikhailovna, when will the sun die? Lyubov Mikhailovna did not seem to know and asked yet another teacher who said it wouldn't be for a long time, not for millions of years, and this temporary reprieve relaxed me a little. There was another reprieve too, though this one was not quite as long. Very early, I'd heard about a prediction of Nostradamus, according to which the end of the world would come about in 1999, brought on by a star called Nemesis, which means vengeance. There was an exact date, August 11th, and so I counted the years. In 1990, I told myself, it won't happen for a while, a whole 9 years. In 1992, I said, a whole 7 years, and so on. Another time, spooked by somebody yet again, I asked my grandfather what he thought about Nostradamus' predictions, and he told me that everything would be as God wills it. Another version of the end of the world was the Second Coming. Very early on, I asked my mother whether there was a God, and Mama told me there wasn't. Some time went by, and I asked her again whether there was a God, and she told me there was, because in that time she had found faith. During Perestroika, there was a lot of literature appearing on the shelves that hadn't been available before. Mama started reading all kinds of esoterica, and as a result of her reading, came to the conclusion that there was a God after all. Well, fine. If there's a God, then there's a God. Thus, I also found faith. Once, Mama and I were walking along the avenue, heading west past the neighborhood library, and the sun was setting and the sky flooded with brilliant crimson gold light, and Mama said, it looks just like Christ in his glory is about to appear in these clouds. So overall, everything pointed to the end of the world happening any minute now. It was closing in from every side. One summer at the dacha, Sanya started teaching me and my girlfriends magic. Sanya and I had a romance going. He said that the world would end next year, the year 2000, and that the final war would happen then too. We were all going to fight in this war, all of us together, me and Sanya, Yurik, Nadia, and Yuta. Later I found out that Russians have been expecting the end of the world and the final war for more than a few hundred years, in the most varied, wild, and ridiculous sectarian guises. And so we, the kids of the 90s, had this too. The war we were going to fight in was, for some reason, the war in Afghanistan, which really hadn't ended. But at the same time, it was going to be the war that marked the beginning of a new world, in which Earth would merge with another planet, its magical double, a home to dragons, elves, and gnomes. And concurrently, it would be the last battle of Armageddon. We were all getting ready to go to this war and to die there. Sanya had already ordered special military uniforms for us. He badly wanted to join the real army, but they wouldn't take him. He told the admissions commission that he practiced magic, but they didn't believe him and said, make something happen then. He made one of the women on the commission get a headache, but they still wouldn't believe him and diagnosed him with schizophrenia. My grandparents had no idea that I was going to go to war and die, and I couldn't tell them, but I felt extremely sorry for them and for all my nice, familiar, beloved things. I began seeing them as already lost forever. Here they were, my nice wash basin, some nice bushes of meadowsweet, my nice grandpa watching television, my nice cat lying out in the sun. Each of my days became, for me, the final day before the war. I was 13, and it was a nice summer. Sanya and I walked in the woods, and once accidentally sat down on an anthill. We rode around on his old motorcycle, and I burned at the soles of my boots, putting my feet on the exhaust pipes. At night, we sat nestled among the roots of an ancient and enormous oak, drinking black monk wine. After work, Sanya would visit me. In the summers, he worked in the village as a plumber. And at my house, he'd hide behind the stove from friends of his that were out looking for him, called Gapon and Master. There was a joke going around about them that they'd drunk a little too much brake fluid. Jealous, he'd tag along when I went to visit Auntie. It was a beautiful summer of waiting for the war and for the end of the world. And then I went back to the city, to school and the 8th grade. Sanya promised to visit me in a month and to call, but as time passed, he did not appear. By the end of October, I found out that he'd actually been in the city for a while and had apparently dumped me, and was now dating Yuta. Though at that point, he had already half-dumped Yuta and was with Nata, a school friend of Nadia's. Such was the end of my first love, and that strange, indelible fairy tale. and also the end of my childhood and the world. I started taking a lot of walks by myself, skipping school and writing poems, and it was astounding to me that everything in the world continued on as before. Up until spring, I waited for the war to begin. I started seeing Yudik, who was officially Nadia's boyfriend, just to stay in the friend group so that they'd take me to war with them. Yudik told me that in our past lives, we'd all fought in Afghanistan and died there. I had been a military pilot and had crashed my plane. Nadia was a nurse. Nuta was a sniper. None of us made it out alive. The world I knew, my childhood world, continued to dissolve. I looked around our tiny kitchen with its red and blue linoleum, where I'd sit and talk on the phone with Yudik, and at the painted roosters on the serving boards, the old electric stove, and I thought about my grandparents, who were sitting in the next room, distressed by these calls with Yudik. I thought about my entire life up until then, perishing before my eyes. How Mama and I had gone to Sochi when I was 10, how I once had a caterpillar that I fed on rosehip leaves. Everything around me was terrifyingly vulnerable. Things were melting away and crying out to me for help. And I had to accept that by going to war, I would be destroying them. In fact, by making the decision, I had already destroyed them. I was in terrible despair because I really had decided to do it, and that had strained my soul to its limit. That autumn and winter, I bid farewell to everything. I wandered by frozen rivers and dark trees, rode the subway aimlessly, hung out at the train station from which we usually left to go to the dacha, walking down the platforms. A few times I went to the neighborhood of high-rises by the bay where I had lived for the first 3 years of my life, to throw myself from the roof of one of those buildings. But it was either that the way to the roof was closed, or that I couldn't even sneak into the lobby, or that I stopped wanting to do it. At night I listened to the radio through my headphones to rock music, and I wrote poems. Something new was hatching inside of me, tearing my heart to bits, but it couldn't quite hatch all the way. Among the concrete fences of the industrial districts, I wandered in darkness, hoping that I'd be raped and murdered by some drunk. Around this time, I started drinking a bottle or two of Baltic-9 beer a day. And then spring came, and nobody went to war. We said it'd been rescheduled, maybe, or gave some other reason. Then Nadia broke up with Yudik, Sanya broke up with Nata, and gradually we all stopped speaking to one another. Nata, whom I saw a few more times, started working as a sales girl at the market and living with her alternating boyfriends. After 9th grade, Nadia went to study fashion design, worked at a photography studio, became an accountant, got baptized, lived for a long time with her common-law husband, then married another man and had a son. Nuta first shaved her head bald, then dropped out of medical school, hung out all over the city with all kinds of people, hitchhiked around the country, and managed to get diagnosed with dromomania, wanderlust syndrome. But then pretty early, around 18, she got married and had a child, then was divorced and now works as a surgical nurse. Yudik got divorced several times, quit drinking for his health, and now assembles furniture. Sanya too got married and then divorced, and also has a job somewhere. And honestly, God bless him, but I still remember how we lay in the pine forest hand in hand, and there was so much holding us together that even now, for me, belongs to the category of things that can't be spoken of. After all of us, ages 13 to 19, died in that war that never happened. I've stopped being scared of the end of the world. I've begun to love it. I've learned to recognize its waves. It passes by very quickly when it comes, and all you can do is shout something senseless in its wake. And when it doesn't come, some people dread it, while others worship it and believe that when it finally arrives, they'll be able to persist in it forever, whereupon they find themselves in front of the TV with a bottle of beer. It arrives and doesn't arrive simultaneously. And you look on in surprise as the whole world crumbles. But the most frightening thing about that is that everything actually stays the same. The same trees, streets, houses, people. And a child's fear that the world will end is a joke when you understand that there's not going to be any more end of the world. Nobody's coming to unlock the crystal jewel box of the world in all its unbearable eternity. All my little life, I wanted to defend the world, to save it, to keep it from dissolving like the clouds and the foam of the sea, but the world tricked me and turned out to be solid, quite solid. One day my father said, "Happiness is anticipation," to which I might add, happiness is the anticipation of the end of the world. Now I know that the end of the world is the limit and the extension, the fulfillment and the miracle, and its function, like the function of limits generally, is to exist and not exist at the same time. To happen so that you give yourself over to it and perish, and never to happen, so that anything else won't be enough. The end is not outside, but at the very heart of the experience of the world, and apocalypse is only one of its names, since the end of the world must be its beginning as well. I wish to live at the heart of the end of the world. I continue to learn to love it, to recognize its various new names in the company of new people, to not be late for it, to work diligently to expand it into the space of life. And no matter how oppressive the solidity of the world becomes, and how variously all of us, the young magicians of that summer, meet our deaths, all of us are, or at least I am, a little bored in the world, because after the floods ended, boredom came, and the queen, the witch who lights her coals in the clay pot, will never want to tell us what she knows and which we do not know.
Thank you, Elina, for a beautiful reading and a beautiful translation. And as you can tell, it is magical language. As you know, like there's already a degree of separation. It's in English, but still, towards the end, it just does something. And also, I want to say that this is just one tiny part of it. You think that you got it. Oh, I now have the introduction and a feel for Alla Gorbunova's book, It's the End of the World. You don't. That it changes completely. It takes you, like Alla said, in a circle, and it's a journey. So it just glimpse through into the tiny part of this forest, into the tiny part of this world. So thank you again, Alla and Elina. And now we are open for questions. And before I do that, I want to read some very moving comments that we've got on from our audience on YouTube. Gary says, Alla Gorbunova is one of the most amazing authors appearing on the Globus platform. And we have a lot of amazing authors appearing on Globus platform. So it's saying something. And Tony Chama, who is watching us from Nairobi, is saying beautiful, even if just audio-wise, listening to this. Like Russian Swahili too has phrases that when translated half drown in the Indian Ocean, which I could believe and I can imagine, and Swahili is also so beautiful. Something to explore as well. Hi, Tatiana. Tatiana is joining us from Kiev. She's a writer, poet, translator, and a publisher, and has been on our shows quite a bit and presented her books. Tatiana, thank you for joining us and looking forward to hearing.
Thank you. Yeah, I wanted to ask about the oracular nature of poetry. Is that important for you?
Yes, it is important for me, but not in a way that it is in classical poetry. So when I think that there are different ways of poetry subject, how poet understands his connection with poetry. In classics, it was like medium of something divine, of something transcendent. Then in now very popular is another way of thinking that the poetry it has is only horizontal, so no transcendent, and it is it has its birth inside our mundane speech, and all. And these two ways, they both are not mine. Oh, sorry. So for me, it is important that poetry must not be only horizontal, and the subject of poetry, he has some, he can has some connection with something transcendental, but it's absolutely different way of this connection, because it is this connection is much more free, and some way maybe it's even reversal if it we can compare it with classical way. So I mean that for me, poetry certainly has a connection. It deals with the truth and with the real, but this connection is not straight. It must be full of how to say, ускользание.
Slippery.
Slipping away.
Slippery.
Yeah.
So this subject, he's somewhere he's slipping from all the definitions, and this and the connection to the truth and to the real is full of some play of some paradoxes. It can
so it shifts. Does it shift? Is it mercurial?
Shift? What is shift?
Shift, change, transform.
Передвигается.
Yeah, yes. It's I think so. You asked about the divine. Yes, it is very important, but it is not classical form of the connection with divine. I think for me.
Okay, thank you. Thanks.
Thank you for an excellent question and for an excellent answer, and also for your excellent English. I mean, you are improvising. Catherine, of course.
Hey, Alla. I'm interested in your discussion of intensities, feeling intensities, and how that leads you to write. And I'm curious how you choose. You're feeling something intensely, you're working intensely. How do you know that it's going to be a poem? How do you know it's going to be prose? How do you choose if the intensity itself is almost beyond words? How do you choose a form for expressing it?
Sometimes I feel that some intensity must become a poem, and some intensity must become a prose or fragment of prose. But sometimes I feel that these intensities, they are B. So they bipolar or bisexual, I don't know how to say. They can be both a prose and a poem, and then this way I write a poem and a prose, and they can be even similar. One written vertically and one horizontally, and so there are a lot of such intersections between my poetry and prose. And I think it's okay, because for me poetry and prose, there are not two different disciplines of mind. It's really the same, because for me poetry is some way of feeling of being, I can say, and this way of feeling of being and walk with being is the same for prose and poetry for me.
And I just wanted to add that to me, this intensities is so much like Blakean energies. It's like the thing of its own. It's so vivid. Thank you.
I just wanted to remark that what I like about Alla's prose is that the language is quite simple and colloquial. So because many of us write from feelings of intensity, but some of us want to shape it into complicated words and so forth. And this is very simple and colloquial, and so that's a nice quality, I think.
Thank you.
I completely agree. And I also, after reading the story several times, I could see that it's also deliberate, because there are pieces and in the second and third part of the world that have the complexity of the language that, you know, the most philosophical text ever. So
I'm not saying it's not complex inside. I'm just saying on the surface, it's simple. So it's possible to find complexity if we go deeper into it. But on the surface, it seems the language is colloquial, you know, it's simple.
I completely agree. It's very laconic and colloquial. Totally, you're right on it. That's the same feeling that I had too. And we have a question from our YouTube audience. And thank you, Tony, again from Nairobi, who's here, an excellent writer and a journalist and a poet, is asking Elina was talking about the end of childhood as the end of the world, or reading in her translation of Alla's work, then of the end of teenage as the end of the world. Is every age set, as we call them in Africa, is the end of the world? And the second part of the question, or is it really the end of relationships, childhood friends, teen friends, campus pals, marriages, that are the end of the world? As you spoke quite a bit about this as the end of the world too.
Well, in this story, the most accent is on the end of the childhood and the end of first love, but I think that we can understand it in the broad sense. So at the end of the story I wrote that the end of the world is also the beginning of the world. So it makes this the sense of these words so huge that it is like, you know, Trotsky wrote about permanent revolution. So it's the permanent end of the world.
Thank you. It's an excellent answer too. I just wanted to add to that the end of the world is perpetual, perhaps in Russia as well, because I totally thought the book was written about the end of the 80s and the beginning of the 90s, like it's, you know, about the slightly earlier than it is, because the feeling was exactly the same. I was stunned to find out that it actually was happening later. So that tells you something, that there is perpetual end of the world, just like you said. Yeah.
Well, yeah, maybe. I don't know. I think that people of my generation have a lot of in common with some people who are elder than we, but somewhere in the late 80s is some limit, and people who were born in the late 80s, they begin to feel the world in a different way, it seems to me. And may I add something to Tatiana's question about the divine? I thought that I need to say that the connection of the subject of my poetry to divineness, I think this unclassic connection is like trickster's position. So it means that this subject, his relationship with the divine, with the truth, with reality, is very unstable and full of play and full of different transformations.
That's great. Speaking of tricksters, I just want to add here that I'm about to load the edited show, the program, or rather talk by Mark Lipovetsky on tricksters. There's a whole fantastic lecture about tricksters and their connection with oracles as well, and on many different levels. So that it's always fascinating to me, and my favorite word is fascinating. If I had to choose one adjective for Globus shows, that would be fascinating. I overuse it. Is how shows often connect one to another. There is this invisible thread for me that I could, like, it's almost like one narrative of this whole world of books, or the created world. I know you don't like the word literature, so I'm not going to use it. Maybe you can read a couple of lines just to hear your voice and your reading of your book.
Couple of lines of my book in Russian. You know, there is this book, there is a cycle of short fragments of prose, like poems and prose. We love you, the dark forest. Maybe something from this part. Старые деревья обладают особой шершавой сучковатой красотой. Иногда такое дерево растет у самого шоссе и наблюдает за дорогой. Знающие люди могут раскрыть такое дерево, как куртку на молнии, и войти внутрь. Внутри кинотеатр. Там показывают долгие медленные фильмы, похожие на сны и весну. За шоссе. После дождя шоссе мокрое и похоже на озеро. На глади его случайные лепестки, дождевые черви. За шоссе красные лавовые поля, где бродят тени осыпающихся облаков. Еще дальше нет ничего, только музыка из-под земли, которую слушают чудовища. Песня троих нищих, присевших отдохнуть на лесной опушке. Влюбившись в красавицу, никогда нельзя быть уверенным, не чудовище ли она, особенно если на это указывают вороны на старом обугленном дереве или трое нищих, присевших отдохнуть на лесной опушке. Земля и лес – это тело чудовища, звезды в небе, его глаза. Мы любим вас, лесные чудовища. Мы любим вас, лесные чудеса.
Thank you. It's beautiful.
Okay.
So it was perfect for me. It was brief because sometimes we have, and there's need for it, the shows that go for a very long time. And sometimes we have this brief, condensed, succinct, as Elina said in the beginning, shows that cover things in depth. And I think this is one of them. And again, this is about this book. I can't wait to see it in English. Good luck to you with your work, Elina. I can't wait to see more books from Alla. It's certainly an event in literary process worldwide. I just wanted to add that June is an extremely exciting month for Globus. Next week, on Monday, we will have an interview with Maria Stepanova with her superb book In Memory of Memory, Pameti Pameti. And it's also a very moving and special moment for me. And I almost wish I had these two interviews more far apart so I could process this and prepare. There's just too much. I feel overwhelmed and yet very lucky to be bringing this richness to you. So if you can join us next week. On the 23rd of June, I have Catherine curating the whole mini conference on Anna Starobinets, who is another profound and outstanding modern Russian Russophone writer. We also have a show on the 16th of June with Melia Glazer on Jews and Ukrainians, 100 years of literary history together, and some of her other books. So please join us, subscribe to the channel to see shows as they are being added. And thank you everyone who joined us today. Again, thank you, Catherine, for making it possible. Thank you to all the people from Kyiv to Nairobi and around the world who joined us today for this marvelous journey and initiation. We are all initiated now. And I'm very lucky to be here and to host this miracle. Thank you so much.
Thanks to everyone who was with us and who will listen to our meeting on YouTube. And thanks again to the Globus Books. I'm very happy that we had this meeting today.
Thank you, Alla. Thank you. Have a wonderful day, wonderful time of the day. Everyone stay safe and see you next week, hopefully to meet Maria Stepanova.